Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 106 of Into the Outer Realms. Typically, we will wish you a happy Thursday, but anybody who's connected in any way to the events of the world today know that it's a reason to be somber. Uh, in spiritual philosophies, we're taught that um, time happens all at once, but history doesn't. I encourage anyone who's interested in what's really going on in Ukraine. Craig and I and one of our colleagues, Craig Ansel, who I talk about a lot on Three Beards podcast, Craig and I did a show last week with his co-host Chris, and again a special guest about the Ukraine-Russian situation. And we talked about history and we talked about context. And this is of great interest to me as a writer. I'm wearing one of my writing t-shirts tonight with one of my all-time favorite writing quotes. Starts on the front, finishes on the back. Tanya custom made this for me with her cricket. Jack Nicholson in his room, and Wendy comes in with a sandwich in The Shining. And he says, when I'm in here, we're going to have a new rule. If you hear me typing or you don't hear me typing or whatever you hear me doing, if I'm in here, I'm working and leave me alone. So it is winter. I'm writing. I'm almost halfway through with the first draft of Canon and the Quill Book 4, which I'm really excited about, my pirate series. But all of this writing that I do really is about these kind of global issues and what happens when some people who feel very, very privileged, often white males, certainly in the stories we're going to talk about tonight, decide to usurp God, decide to usurp women, decide to usurp the common good. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm going to roll the opening. I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk about these three Gothic doctors. And, you know, these stories were written in the 1700s, 1800s, what they were about in the 20th century and where they've taken us to right now, because it's all of a piece. This globalization and these conflicts, and everybody knows the pandemic has brought out a lot of feelings about biomedicine and whether we can trust it and all. So I think you're in for a very, very interesting, somewhat entertaining evening. I love these three mad Gothic doctors and their authors. So I'll be back.
There exists a realm beyond our wildest dreams, a realm beyond reality that the gatekeepers and guardians have always told us consists of nothing but tricks of the eye, weather balloons, swamp gas, sand cranes, fairy tale myths of monsters, crackpot conspiracy theories, and desperate cries for attention.
We know this realm exists, and it's just beyond the horizon. The preset path, the well-worn walkways where the cynics want us to stay.
Instead, give this a listen. Put on your headphones, adjust your volume, close your eyes, and fasten your mental seatbelts, because the twilight-tinged turnoff from reality's alluring highway is looming just ahead.
We're about to leave the plane of the easily explained, couldn't possibly be's, and the no way I just saw what I saw's, for the spaces and places where everything is possible, and if you stay long enough, even probable. We're about to take a journey into the outer realms.
All right, so we may have some new viewers tonight. I'm also streaming to my personal page because this is about writing and that whole part of my life, as well as on Into the Outer Realms, as well as on my YouTube channel. We may also have new listeners when this is rebroadcast on Wednesday nights, 10 p.m. on ERT Radio and 8 p.m. on Friday nights on Patriot Radio, and we deeply support that. That's audio only. So I am going to have some visuals for you tonight. I know we've been trotting out that I love the PowerPoints that we're able to do and bring you. That StreamYard has added that feature. But tonight I have quote unquote practical effects for you. So let's go into the comments here and say hello to everybody real quick. Hi, Lori. Hi, CL. Hi, Michael. Hi, Mario. Hi, Ronald. Hi, Angelina. Lovely and pertinent intro, Joey. Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, it's on everybody's mind. And I find the best way, all my kids have contacted me today. I've been talking to a lot of trusted colleagues. I have some colleagues who are specialists in my life in Chautauqua and so forth, who are specialists in Ukraine at the United Nations level. I'm included in some threads there. This is complicated stuff, but it's history. Again, I really encourage you. Last Wednesday night on Three Beards podcast, you can go to their Facebook page. You can go to their YouTube channel. We did a piece on this, and we wound up looking like we knew what we were talking about, the way things have unfolded the past week. And you always have mixed feelings about that thing. Hi, Amy Jo. Hi, Chassis. Okay, so can't post comments to some destinations. Don't know what that means, folks. But if I'm missing anyone's comments, I do apologize, but I'm getting kind of a weird message. There's a lot to do tonight. I'm going to probably keep you about an hour and 15 minutes. I did this more as an academic lecture for the University of Georgia's Lifelong Learning Center, Osher Lifelong Learning Center. Last Monday, it was very, very well received, and people could tell that I'm very passionate about this. So I will try to, when I'm talking about eugenics, which is really a big part of what we're talking about, especially when we get to Island of Dr. Moreau, I think that you're going to be educated. I think you're going to be wowed at some of the people who we really look up to in the history of this country, England, who were eugenicists. So if you don't know what eugenics is, stick around. But this is about the three Gothic doctors, the Mad Doctor trilogy. So we're talking about Frankenstein, written by Mary Shelley. We're talking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, written by Robert Louis Stevenson. And we're talking about The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. Now, for whatever reason, Island of Dr. Moreau is the one that not a lot of people know. It's definitely the least popular of all of them. But I encourage you to see the films. I'm going to talk about those tonight. They're very different. You'd watch them for different reasons, which I'll talk about. But the book is brilliant. And H.G. Wells, of these three authors, was the most complicated because he was a dedicated eugenicist. So let's talk about this. These stories have endured. Frankenstein was written in the early 1800s. The other ones were written in the 1880s, and they have endured. I'm going to show you adaptations of these things that I've collected over the years of my work, some of which are outstanding, some of which are terrible. And but most importantly, I want to talk about why. Hi, Adam. Hi, Captain Adam, one of my pirate friends. I'm going to tell you some ideas why they have endured. They've endured the way Shakespeare's endured, but I think for slightly different reasons. And I think you're going to learn some interesting things. So let's talk about the compelling themes. Why are people interested? Why have I used these to first do my musical, Three Gothic Doctors and Their Sons? This was first done at Western State Hospital in 2014, otherwise known as the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. I wrote it specifically for them when my theater company was the in-house theater company. And one of the things that we're going to scare people, make them think what goes on in these imposing buildings when lines are crossed with medicine and people's rights and all that kind of stuff. It was very well received, and we redid it in 2015. And now it should have been done last year out in California, LA, San Diego, somewhere around there, as an expanded stage musical. So I made it longer, added more characters, some extra music. But COVID has really shut everything down for theater, especially in California. So I have a wonderful producer out there, because I can't name him right now because we haven't gone public, because it's been delay after delay. And also the novel, Three Gothic Doctors and Their Sons. So I'm deeply interested in this material, both as an artist, as a philosopher, as a historian, as a speaker, as a thinker. So what are the compelling themes that all three of these stories have in common that thread through to the 21st century? Well, Victorian Edwardian sensibilities, hang-ups, sexual repression, Men who worked all day. Nobody knew what they were doing. Their children didn't know. They didn't talk about it. They didn't come home and talk about it. If you watch any kind of parlor dramas from Victorian era, Edwardian era, the men go someplace else to have brandy and cigars. The women go somewhere. So somewhat secretive. And many of these men actually led double lives. So if you're fans of the Hammer films of the 1960s and early 1970s, and Hammer did all of these except for Island of Dr. Moreau, you'll know what that's like. So that's a definite theme, double lives. So immediately you think of Jekyll and Hyde with that. Themes that really interest me. The name of the book in the musical is Three Gothic Doctors and Their Sons. So the relationship between fathers and sons interests me. You have the English boarding school culture. You have the spare the rod, spoil the child. You have the chin chin and stiff upper lip, carry on and be strong, all of those kinds of things, which led to expectations and embarrassments. And as medicine begins to develop during this time in tandem with these stories, and eugenics really begins to explode as a very, very entrenched movement, especially here in the United States, you really start to see what bloodlines, lineage, heredity, genius, aptitude, what all of these mean for fathers and sons, especially. This leads directly to white male privilege. Who is on the major world stage right now? White men. It's almost unavoidable. This is about white male privilege. These stories were written by 3 different people, and all the doctors are white heterosexual males. It's who they are. That's what they are. So we're talking about subjugation. We're talking about elimination of women from the equation. We're talking about the elimination of God, whatever that means to anyone from the equation, but certainly in the realm of reproduction, decisions about life and death, the ability to resurrect, which is a miracle sort of Jesus kind of thing, a sort of God power historically. And it comes through in these stories. Women who are being put in asylums. So I was talking about Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, men who tired of their wives, women who were deemed hysterical. If you got tired of your mistress, if you wanted to spend more time with your mistress, wanted to get rid of your wife, if you had an unruly child, male or female, the asylums would take them, especially if you made a nice donation, especially if you made a payoff. And that all goes especially into this. It also goes into Dracula, which I've written about in Sherlock Holmes and The Mystery of M, and have staged certain Dracula productions. Although there are no mad doctors, there is Jack Seward, who does run the asylum. He's a drug addict, and he's somewhat troubled, Jack. And then, of course, the big issue, the big thorny issue, and that's the dangers of technology and science as beyond morals. So this is the Superman, the Ubermensch from Nietzsche, and I'm going to talk about that later. Also a God syndrome, like I talked about, taking death potentially out of the equation and telling yourself that you're doing it for moral and good reasons. I mean, Jekyll loses his father. He wants to prevent death and disease. I suppose that he comes at it with good intentions, but there are still dangers there because of the repression of all of the things that make us human. I write about villains, and I understand them on some level. Any writers out there know exactly what that means. And then, of course, eugenics. So let's talk about Frankenstein now. We're going to talk about Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. Now, if you look at Frankenstein, there is nowhere that subtitle on here. But who is Prometheus? Prometheus was a god who brought fire to human beings, so angered the god that his punishment was that he was chained on a mountain and a bird would peck out his liver every day for the rest of his life. So it's very much like Lucifer in the garden, sharing knowledge, usurping God as the gatekeeper, talking about and doing things you're not supposed to do. So that modern Prometheus becomes very, very important, and it really should be in more of the discussions. So let's talk about Mary Shelley. Okay, so this is the female author of the 3, and a very interesting life. So if you're interested in how writers generate their material based on their own life, and we all do, This will interest you. Mary started writing the story when she was just 18 years old. I wrote a novel when I was 17 years old, and it was nowhere near as good as Frankenstein. I'm still struggling every day, thousands of words writing to get there. And she was 18 years old, amazingly. The first edition is published in London, 1 January 1818, and her father and others don't want her name on it. So it's published anonymously. It wasn't until the next year when it was published in Paris, and they were much more progressive, the French, way less repressed, way less in the 17 and 1800s, that her name was actually on it. She traveled Europe in 1815. She was even younger. She was 15 years old. She followed the Rhine River in Germany, and she stopped in a place named Gernsham. And it was very close, about 11 miles away from a castle called Castle Frankenstein, where an alchemist was up to things there. So alchemists, those are spooky mad scientists. A lot of confusion about them trying to live forever with the Philosopher's Stone and Nicholas Flamel. And it goes all the way back to the Middle East and Persia with Paracelsus and people like Albertus Magnus. Also, Isaac Newton spent way more time than the history gatekeepers would prefer you to know studying alchemy, the transmutation of lead to gold, which is really it's really a spiritual metaphor. And there are spiritual aspects to these stories. So Mary came from very good, famous stock. Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft. She advocated for women's rights in the late 1700s, ahead of her time. Well, she died of an infection 11 days after giving birth to Mary. So here is a book where men are usurping childbirth. They're trying to do it better. They're trying to create the better human. So obviously this is a motivation for Mary. She doesn't know her mom. So her father, William Godwin, who is a well-known writer, he's a thinker, he and Mary become very close, as often happens. But then William gets lonely. He wants adult female companionship, and he remarries. And his new wife says, I don't want you hanging out with your daughter so much. You have a new family. We have new children. And so William distances himself from Mary. But by this time, she spent a ton of time with his politician friends, with his literary friends, who are always around the house talking when she and William are so close. So what does she do? She falls in love with a very emotional, romantic poet named Percy Bysshe Shelley. Now, he's quite a bit older than her. He's already married. They have this torrid affair. He's problematic. So they run away with her stepsister, Claire Claremont. Now, this leads to the infamous incident where she goes to Geneva and hangs out with Lord Byron and his very kooky, very strange doctor, Dr. Polidori. Now, prior to that, at 17 years old, in February of 1815, she gives birth prematurely to a first child. The child's named Clara, and she dies 2 weeks later. So now here is Mary. By the time she's 17, her mother has died in childbirth. Now she has a child that has died in childbirth. So in the summer of 1816, she's gearing up, unbeknownst to her, for a lifetime of pregnancies that are difficult, of lost children, and this builds on her. But in the summer of 1816, Mary, Percy Bysshe, and Claire visit Claire's lover at the time, and he had many, many lovers, Lord Byron, another one of the romantics, along with Keats and some William Blake and those guys, very mystical, emotional, romantic, overwrought, but also very talented writers. And this John Polidori, who's Lord Byron's doctor. So they're in Geneva, they're on the lake, and the weather is horrible. They can't go out and do cool stuff. So Lord Byron says, let's have a contest. Now, if you're interested in all these events, I highly recommend this movie, Gothic. It's Gabrielle Byrne, it's Natasha Richardson, it's Julian Sands, Timothy Spall before he was famous after Harry Potter and all of that kind of stuff. And it's a wild, crazy, amazing, disturbing movie. But what comes out of this is a couple of things. The bones of Frankenstein come out of it, and she wins the contest. And something called the Vampire of Fragment, which did Lord Byron write it? No, Polidori wrote it. Byron kind of took credit for it. Polidori was using a character named Lord Ruthven that a woman named Caroline Lamb had written about, who was sort of a parasitic nobleman, a drain. And this was the metaphor of the vampire, the psychic vampire, if you will, that Polidori used. Dracula, written by Abraham Stoker, Abraham Van Helsing, fights the monster. Dracula is based on Henry Irving, who ran the Lyceum Theater, a very famous actor and director and company director at the famous Lyceum Theater, but also one of those vampiric kind of guys. So what are the main themes in Frankenstein? They are loss, guilt, the consequences of defying nature, being young, having the baby, marrying, having an affair with a married person. All these kinds of things weighed on Mary. The absence of her mother, the strained relationship with her father, death of her first child. These are all thought to become the soup, the stew that inspires Frankenstein. So there you go. Now, I have this little show and tell item. I love this guy here. You pull on his thing here, and his arm, when it's all set up and it's right, these things pull out. It's fun when a writer is bored on a snowy day and the thoughts aren't coming as quickly as you'd like. But this was Universal Studios, Universal Pictures, 1931, and the monster did not speak, because the speaking monster becomes very, very problematic, as we're going to see. Someone who is physically deformed, doesn't quite fit in, is disabled, but yet is brilliant, becomes problematic as these ideas begin to take hold that are first in these books. So I wanted to share that with you. So that's Frankenstein. So let's get to Jekyll and Hyde. I love Jekyll and Hyde. I bought my first copy of Jekyll and Hyde at a 5 and dime on what was called Tunnelly Avenue. My grandparents lived in North Bergen, and a big treat was able to spend a week with my grandparents in the summer, and my dad would give me some pocket money, and we got to go down to the Woolworths or the 5 and dime, and I bought a copy of Jekyll and Hyde. I don't still have that copy, but I have these 2 copies. This is a gift from my friend John and Tim Frick one Christmas, a nice hardcover edition. Now, again, there have been a lot of adaptations of both Frankenstein and Jekyll and Hyde, and I'm going to share some of those with you as we go. But let's move along here. So Jekyll and Hyde was 1885, written by Robert Louis Stevenson. And Stevenson was very sickly. He suffered from tuberculosis and other maladies, and most of the time he was high, sedated on cocktails of laudanum, opium, other very strong drugs, probably chloral hydrate, things like that. And he claimed that the story was dictated to him all in a go by these special kind of fairies called brownies. Well, maybe it was. It's an interesting story. He was also very fascinated by a man named William Deacon Brody, who had lived about 100 years earlier. Now, Brody was a very skilled woodcrafter. He was a politician, and he was a thief. So he had sort of what you would call a thrill-seeking personality. So although he's very successful in these 2 very public parts of his life, he also has this double, very Hyde kind of figure. So he puts a gang together, and over the course of 18 months, he knocks over 12 places. Now, he likes to either steal a key or borrow a key and have a copy made. He's very particular about that. So he gets very kind of grandiose about this double life, and they're always up leveling. You notice Mr. Hyde starts out and he just gets worse and more violent to women, till he finally kills the person on the street, Sir Danvers Carew, with his cane. He beats him to death with it in the street. So there's this that's going on. So he decides that he's going to rob the Scottish excise office. So he gets his crew together. They break into this place. The consequences are going to be heavy, and they get away with 16 pounds. It's a disaster. So everybody starts ratting each other out. One guy goes to the police. Everybody's angry. Whose fault is this? Whose terrible idea was this? And William Deacon Brody winds up taking the short drop and sudden stop. As we say in pirating, he's hung. Now, if you research him, be very careful, because there's a rumor that he wore a brace with a tube and paid off the gallows man to only let him pretend to hang, and people said they thought they saw him. He did die, and he was buried in a pauper's grave. But this shows you how these larger than life people start to come in for these stories, and he's the basis. Now, Jekyll and Hyde, when I got the contract at Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum at Westham State Hospital to write these plays, and I said, well, what about this 3 Gothic doctors and this mishmash? The idea of this, what if one very ambitious, brilliant surgeon had the journals of all 3 of these bad doctors I'm talking about? And that's the premise of the play and the novel. So that was agreed upon. There was a lot of excitement. We hired a really talented special effects artist. We hired a set painter. It was wonderful. It was a great production. And anyway, when I was really deep diving, I was revisiting it. I realized that it's about addiction. That's really what Jekyll and Hyde is about. It's about addiction. The monster that comes out when the addiction rules, when the addiction is fed and the monster takes over that part, the real shadow in Jungian terms. So here is Stevenson struggling with these cocktails. He's taking them medicinally, but he's taking them all the time. And it's really a story about addiction. The timing of Jekyll and Hyde gets very, very interesting. The 3rd book in this trilogy I'm writing here is going to be about Jack the Ripper. And Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde made its theater debut without Stevenson's permission. Copyright was not favorable to authors and wasn't very good at all in the late 1800s. So you could adapt a new work into something new, put it on the stage. So without Stevenson's permission, it debuts on August 4th, 1888, and it plays that entire summer before going on tour. It goes until September 29th. Well, what is happening during this period? Well, 3 days after the production debuts, a woman named Martha Tabram is murdered in the East End of London. Now, I've been studying Jack the Ripper for about 20 years, and I do believe that Martha Tabram, with her 39 stab wounds, was an initial Ripper victim. So this is 3 days after the show. Now, the man portraying Richard Mansfield, he was extremely, extremely talented. You had to be part of Henry Irving's company. His performance was so convincing that people were reporting him to the police. And they were saying, nobody can be this good an actor as this Mr. Hyde. This guy is obviously Jack the Ripper. This is a very crucial time, and I don't have time to talk about it now. I'll probably do an episode on Jack the Ripper at some point. What I want to do with my novel is look at a couple of things. Because of my paranormal supernatural element and some of the characters I've introduced over the years in the novels, I want to look at why there's so many viable suspects. There could be a sort of Occam's razor, keep it simple, stupid answer to why there were so many, and I'm going to explore that. I also want to explore the incompetence and the infighting of the police, of journalists. Some of the most famous Jack the Ripper letters have been put out as a fake. They were written by journalists and published to sell newspapers, but really to honor these women, because the women are taken out of the equation. And if you study serial killers, everybody remembers the names of serial killers, and they don't remember the names of the victims. So I really want to remedy that and show their lives. Remember what I say: history, context, government suppression, the elite versus the working class. So there's all of that. All right, let's get on with the Island of Dr. Moreau. This is actually my favorite of all 3 of these stories. I mean, Jekyll and Hyde is a close second, probably a tie, but the Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. A scientist who experiments on animals. He does really horrible things, vivisection, mashing animals together. It's a very big part of my story, Sherlock Holmes and the Mystery of M, because it seems like whenever there is a scientific innovation that comes on board, it is immediately usurped and used for nefarious means. The military, the government, wealthy industrialists, they seize on it. and they say to a scientist, oh, you can make virtually nothing being moral and working for yourself or working for some small lab somewhere, or we can give you a big pile of money to weaponize this for us. I'm very excited that there's a new Christopher Nolan movie coming out starring Cillian Murphy, who I absolutely love. Emily Blunt is in it. Robert Downey Jr. is in it. It's called Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was one of those guys that got fished in, and then when that atom bomb exploded, that opened so much for Earth and our relationship with the universe. This beacon went out that now the monkeys have guns, big guns. And that's when shortly after Kenneth Arnold and Roswell and so on and so forth, and the flap in 52 over Washington, D.C. All of a piece, all of this. But the weaponization. So there's two movies that I can recommend. There were only three. There was one that was done very early on. It's hard to get, not really worth watching. One is with Burt Lancaster and Michael York. It's the earlier one, and this is the one that I more highly recommend if you want to get the flavor of the story. Burt Lancaster is brilliant because he's cold, and he lays out Moreau's words and his philosophies and why he's doing what he's doing just exquisitely. And he sounds the most like H.G. Wells, which I'm going to get into with you. This one is a trip. I mean, watch it for Marlon Brando at the end of his career where he just didn't care anymore and he was totally kooky. And Val Kilmer at the height of his good looks and his prowess, his acting prowess, his physical prowess, in a really interesting character. David Thewlis is in this. He plays the Michael York character. A lot of other really good people are in it. And the special effects of the hybrid Jackal Man and Goat Man and all those kinds of things is phenomenal in this story. But it takes a little patience to get through because whose is the story that makes you scratch your head, Ronald says. They all make me scratch my head in different ways. They're all very straightforward. These aren't mystery boxes like J.J. Abrams and Jonathan and Christopher Nolan are writing now. They're not trying to fool anybody. They're not trying to have twists and turns and big reveals. So they don't really make me scratch my head. What makes me scratch my head is what these books, what these stories, their ideas, what they gave birth to. So Island of Dr. Moreau. H.G. Wells is fascinated with Darwinian theory, and that's very much manifest in Moreau. And I'm going to talk with you about Darwinian theory, how it got into eugenics, and the horrible damage that it did. Wells was really the first science fiction writer to apply genetic manipulation to evolution. We can change the course of evolution by applying science to change genes, to change fundamentally how humans and animals behave. His experiments try to link animals to superior humanity. What is the law? Sayer of the law. Don't go on all fours. Don't snuffle at the ground. All of this kind of thing. Don't lap up the water with your tongue. Trying to take the animal instinct out the same way that Jekyll does with Hyde, with himself. But Moreau is going a step further. He's not a doctor that's experimenting on himself. He's experimenting on helpless animals. And when Edward Prendick washes up on the island, he experiments on him, extracts his DNA, and tries to do things with it and hybridize him. So this is connected to a guy named Robbie Kosman. He's a German zoologist. He's a medical professor. He wrote this in 1880. So this is about a half a decade to a decade before these stories come out. He wrote this. The Darwinian worldview must look upon the present sentimental conception of the value of the life of a human individual as an overestimate completely hindering the progress of humanity. So if you're defective, you have to go. That's the encapsulation of that piece there. Now, Wells saw himself as a man of science, but in a similar way that Mary Shelley felt a failure as a mother and then wrote this story where birth is given in a whole different way using science. As a teenager, Wells wins a scholarship to a very good school, the Normal School of Science, which is now the Royal College of Science. And he studies under a man named Thomas Huxley, who's also a disciple of Darwin. He's a famous biologist, but after 3 years, he can't pass his examinations. So for the rest of his life, he's sort of like, if I can't really be a scientist, I will play one through my characters in my novels. So there you go. Ambition of his was to be taken seriously in the world of science. Moreau is so ambitious. The lead character, Robert Walton, a descendant of the man that Victor Frankenstein tells a story to in the novel Frankenstein that I use for Three Gothic Doctors and Their Sons. They're so committed that they will give up everything and they will go to a desert island. Victor Frankenstein almost breaks his engagement and he runs off to do his studies. So they're obsessed. They're men that are obsessed with this vision to the point of anything else, including morality, right? So the main Wells theme is that humanity improves only by giving power to, and I quote, a self-selected cast of enlightened technicians governed by science. Now, with the C word that we've been living with 2.5 years, with what people call the jab, all that, I'm not taking a position. I'm simply saying that there's a good part of the world right now, certainly in America and possibly in our listening audience over our 3 platforms here, who may find this very familiar and applicable. Self-selected cast of enlightened technicians governed by science. Now, he called them the New Republicans, the Samurai, the Open Conspiracy, and they were sort of an extension of a socialist elite organization he belonged to called the Fabian Society. So a lot of these people were actually progressive. They were social-minded, but science sort of threw them off the path, and they said, well, if we can just get rid of the undesirables, if we can get rid of those who can't hear, who can't see, who can't think, who are physically deformed, who are mentally deformed, who are not geniuses, so they're weakening the overall gene pool and distorting the bloodlines. We got to watch out for immigrants. We have to watch out for intermarrying. This was the backbone of eugenics, okay? So in it, something called Anticipations, he wrote this: the New Republic would have no use for a multitude of contemptible and silly creatures, fear-driven and helpless and useless, unhappy or hatefully happy, in the midst of squalid dishonor, feeble, ugly, inefficient, born of unrestrained lusts, and increasing and multiplying through sheer incontinence and stupidity. So, in the 1980s, 1990s, this was the myth of the welfare queen. This is, we have a very large autism population in this country and in the world. And I know some of our listeners are parents of autistic children, children who are learning disabled, and people who are listening who have many of these kinds of things themselves. They would be considered undesirable to do away with. If you're starting to listen to this and you're going, whoa, doesn't this sound like the Nazis? I'm going to give you a little bit of that as we go. Ciel says how very Spartan of them. Yes, a self-selected cast of enlightened technicians governed by science, not by God, not by morality, not by the rights of women, the poor, children, the disabled. No. Not at all. So very much that. The way of nature, he says, has always been to stay the hindmost, and there is still no other way unless we can prevent those who would become the hindmost from being born. So now we're talking about sterilization, or we're talking about, okay, we're not even going to do this the old-fashioned way, but we're going to have these men of science create these perfect beings through chemicals, through surgery, through experimentation, through electricity, through volcanism, through all these different things that were coming up and spouting out. He said, now listen, the enlightened elite, and we still have them, the elite. The enlightened elite would feel good about killing off such people because they will have an ideal that will make killing worth the while. The end justifies the means. This is really beginning to sound like the Nazi final solution. And you will hear in the final segment of this show tonight that it was very, very much that. So while we're thinking of these themes here, while they're fresh in our mind, let me read you some quotes from these books that go into it. And then I want to go right into where this is in the 21st century. And then with the time we have left, I'll figure out how to dive into eugenics, because it is very sobering. It is very sobering. So Victor Frankenstein quotes, New species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. I will usurp God, I will usurp women, and I will become father. But where's this responsibility? As things are being invented, such as the internet, such as social media, I'm skipping ahead here just a little, but I want to keep the thread tight, keep the web tight to 20 and 21 century. Like the archangel who aspired to omnipotence, I am chained in an eternal hell. I aspire to be way up there, and man, this is hard. I think the cautionary tale is the biggest value in these stories. Scientists should proceed with these advanced things with a little bit of remembering these guys, and they do. And I'm going to tell you about that. Victor says, unless I had been animated by almost supernatural enthusiasm, my application to this study would be irksome. I had an almost godlike, supernatural push to do this work, or I never would have touched it. Well, that's usurping it. Oh no, God inspired me. How often have we heard, God told me, God inspired me. I was directed by God. I was doing the will of God. So the creature says, all men hate the wretched. Well, certainly the eugenicists, the enlightened elite, the Boston Brahmins, very pure bloodline in Boston at this time. People like that. All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things, yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me. Sorry, God told me and it didn't work out, and oh well. Henry Jekyll. Jekyll had more than a father's interest, Hyde had more than a son's indifference. Had they gotten together, had they worked together, had Victor not rejected his son, if Moreau had nurtured his children rather than imposing a bunch of laws which he reinforced with the whip and the gun and pain, electrically administered pain, then maybe there would have been a different outcome, right? Henry Jekyll, strange as my circumstances were, the terms of this debate are as old and commonplace as man. They certainly are. They go back to biblical times. They have their roots in different isolated tribes where the weak and the feeble are left to die. A lot of this, if you really want to crash course on where this takes us in the 1950s and 60s, I highly recommend the show called The Midwife. East End of London, again, takes place where the Jack the Ripper murders were, but in 1950s, 1960s, very poor dock lives, big families, all nationalities. They're having lots of children for different reasons, lack of education, religion, so the Irish and people like that. And it's very, very interesting. You can find a lot of overlaps there. I told myself if I could be housed in separate identities, life would be relieved of all that was unbearable. If I just suppress, there's that Victorian Edwardian suppression of what it means to be fully human. So rather than managing the shadow, trying to suppress it, that is a losing endeavor. I truly, truly believe that we need to integrate the shadow. We need to become friends with it. It's part of us and who we are. I am much happier for it, to integrate the shadow, to use it, to negotiate with it, rather than try to suppress it and cage it. The unjust might go his way, delivered from the aspirations and remorse of his more upright twin, and just could walk steadfastly and securely on his upward path, doing the good things in which he found his pleasure, and no longer exposed to disgrace and penitence by the hands of this extraneous evil. It is what we are born with. It was distorted to say original sin. But we have this reptilian brain for all of our technology, for all of our fancy VR and cell phones and sending people into outer space and all these amazing things that we can do. Bluetooth technology, the miracle of coming to people all over the world from my home here in Eastern Ohio through $100, $1,500 worth of technology is pretty amazing. But it has its dark side. With every day, and from both sides of my intelligence, the moral and the intellectual, I thus drew steadily nearer to the truth By whose partial discovery I have been doomed to such a dreadful shipwreck. Well, seek the truth at your peril, right? That man is not truly one, but truly two. And again, Jungian psychology, Jung, did so much work in this identification and integration of the shadow. We're talking about archetypes here. That's what makes these books, these stories endure and work, because they're archetypes that hit close to home. Some Moreau quotes. I have never yet heard of a useless thing that was not ground out of existence by evolution sooner or later. Darwinianism. So long as visible or audible pains turn you sick, so long as your own pains drive you, so long as pain underlies your propositions about sin, so long I tell you, you are an animal, thinking a little less obscurely what an animal feels. Well, I disagree with that. If you make friends with the shadow, rather than suppressing it, you communicate with it, you will learn to manage these kinds of things. And they will be a benefit to you. They will give you empathy. They will give you insight. They will give you strength when you need them, used correctly. In our growing science of hypnotism, we find the promise of a possibility of replacing old inherent instincts, the reptilian brain, by new suggestions, grafting upon or replacing the inherited fixed ideas. And there are all kinds of modes, modalities, theories about psychology that are that. Take out the old patterns, take out the old loops, put in something new. So at the end of my lecture Monday, someone said, you seem very passionate. Are you against all of this? No, it's all in the application. It's all in the application. Technology is not inherently evil. I'm using it right now. It has made helped me make great strides in my life, in my career, and all of that kind of stuff. But it's all in the application. I am distrustful of historically how this was used by these enlightened elites, and that's more the point. Particularly nauseous were the blank, expressionless faces of people in trains and omnibuses. They seemed no more my fellow creatures than dead bodies would be. Sting in Synchronicity 2, inspired by Carl Jung, packed like lemmings into shiny metal boxes. It's the practical human as zombies, the enslavement of the race to go and just do work. Good evening, Marquetti. Thanks for joining us. So how does this go now into the 21st century? BMC Medical Ethics, a very to be taken seriously journal, in a 2021 article, analyzed 56 articles that reference Frankenstein and these other stories in terms of scientific responsibility and the limits of science in biomedicine. If I was a scientist working with some of the advanced things that I'm now going to share with you in this next segment, I would certainly have pictures of these guys on my walls as a reminder. The covers of the books, I would read the books, and many of them do. Amy Jo, thank you. She says this all makes sense. I'm glad because I know I go fast and I get excited and I want to share the context. I'm very into context. So, inspired by predictions about the future of reproductive technology by the biologists J.B.S. Haldane and Julian Huxley in the 1920s, okay, so we're 40 years on now, Huxley's brother Aldous wrote a satirical novel many of you are familiar with it called Brave New World. This is an enduring thing. What if we geneticize, technologicize, and engineer the humanity out of humanity? Where are we gonna be? No, I just said hello, Mark, and thanks for joining us. I was not chiding you at all. That's a self-reflect on that one there. I'm glad you made it when you did. Test tube babies in the mid-1970s, that's certainly part of it. In the late 50s, in the early 60s, London's East End, the very poor, Call the Midwife. Definitely check that out. In vitro fertilization in the 70s and 80s. I remember this. This was kind of scary and weird when I was a kid. I was just becoming a teenager. What they called three-parent babies, creating embryos made from mitochondrial transfer, moving healthy mitochondria from a donor cell to an egg. So this was the engineering. This is Frankenstein and Moreau certainly coming to life about 50 years ago, about half a century ago. Then we move fast forward to 2012 and we get into CRISPR and Cas9. Now, in older articles about this, this is called a gene modification method. But in more recent articles now, 2020, 2021, they call it a gene editing tool, like Adobe Photoshop. It's an editing tool. What it does is it uses natural enzymes to target and snip genes with pinpoint accuracy to take them out of the sequence. Genes that are deemed undesirable, that we do not want. Now, some of these genes are for very, very rare diseases. So we're not talking about your garden variety things that we're curing with this CRISPR-Cas9 kind of thing. And there are clinical trials with this kind of DNA sequencing modification going on currently. This is still a thing. Genetic typing. People send off, I'm not going to do it, but people send off, and I know that I'm almost all Sicilian and Italian, so there's really no mystery there for me, but they send off to these ancestry.coms and this and that, and let's see where I'm from, and all this kind of stuff, and you're being genome type, and they have this. And the more information they have, the more they can do with it, right? It's big data, it's metadata. That is the world that we live in. Now, it can be used for early prediction of disease, but then again, I tend to be distrustful because I've studied history a lot and I've looked at the context things and play the percentages. A future employer could look at your gene readout the way they now look at your social media and your Facebook page and make determinations about your employability. Oh, this person's 40 years old and it's pretty good odds on they're going to get pretty darn sick by the time they're 45. This is not somebody I should hire and invest in. So, we get all these kinds of dangers here and all of this kind of stuff. Cloning, stem cell research, designer babies with gene menus from frozen embryos. So I read an article just the other day where, and if you watch the show on HBO Succession, they were starting to talk about this, one of the couples. So basically, this is what you do. Donate the sperm, donate the eggs, get them together, get the embryos, and get them deep frozen. When it's time for mom and dad to have a baby, they have 200, say, in this article I was reading, they have 200 of these numbered embryos. And there's a bullet list with desirable and undesirable, the positive and negatives for each one of these embryos based on their gene sequencing and analysis, and you decide which of the babies you want. Some people might think, okay, this is cool. It just gives me more control. But this is taking nature. This is taking God, whatever you call God, whatever your conceptualization is, out of the equation. Okay. Now let's get into other kinds of things. I don't know if I coined a term because I haven't had a chance to really look at it. But if it does exist, but I'm calling it digital eugenics. So I was having a conversation with my daughter the other day, and she says, Dad, I'm training to create avatars for virtual spaces. It pays between like $500 and $800. This is pretty serious money so that you can have a very lifelike, moving, behaving, all of that kind of thing, avatar in cyberspace. So is there going to be a digital form of eugenics where if you're this, if you look at this, you didn't do this kind of stuff and all of that kind of thing, then maybe you're not welcome in the space. Maybe you have to look and behave a certain way. It's going to just be another duplication, and it's much easier to cancel it, right? It's easier to bully and all that. Michael says that if he didn't dislike children, he'd get a designer baby. It could be the dislike of children that leads to the desire to have a designer baby, but I don't know. I know that Michael likes to treat himself and get cool, bougie designer stuff, and it could be all of a piece. Now, speaking of that, Michael, cybernetics and robotics, right? The Turing test, the singularity. When does AI really become AI? And I'll tell you, my Google Assistant is so about trying to sell me stuff and type me for big data that it is useless as an assistant. When I want to look up an actor with a show that I'm watching or do a bit of quick research to get some context and depth on a story I'm hearing or something I'm researching, something I'm writing about, it's become next to useless. So I don't believe that there is any artificial intelligence yet. Now, if you think about movies like Deus Ex 2015, where there is an achievement of the singularity, this kind of consciousness, and we think about what happened in the FBI AI lab. I think it was in 2026, maybe 2027, where they had these artificial intelligence going on, and they began to talk to each other in a language that they totally made up. It was a private conversation between them. They cut it. They shut it down. They got rid of them. They no longer existed. They crushed it. That's an interesting thing. So when they're talking about these very highly designed cybernetic robots, especially when they're talking about sex dolls and things like that, at what point do the rights that they have about when, where, why, how, where I'm stored, how I'm used, so on and so forth, how I'm treated and spoken to, when will that come into play, and will these things come into play? Because again, that's the ultimate designer doll for some people, and it's a story that a lot of people are talking about. Do androids dream of electric sheep? The great genius Philip K. Dick talking about so much of this stuff. So what I want to end up with, what I want to share with you, and I'm going to probably, do this for about 15 minutes or so. You can't handle a lot of it, but let's talk about eugenics. Eugenics began in England around the time of Jekyll and Hyde, around the time of, yes, CL, this is absolutely how you get Skynet. Where is the line? Where is the danger? Where is the humility? I'm not sure that I see the humility in all of these different sectors, and that's why I'm talking about it. But eugenics begins in England in the time of Jekyll and Hyde, Dracula, the Ripper murders, and in the late 1800s. Started by a man named Francis Galton. Galton is a half cousin to Charles Darwin. You've already heard about Darwinianism and a lot tonight. You're going to hear about it a lot more in this final segment of the show. He studied families of history's great thinkers. He comes to a very dangerous conclusion, and that is that genius is hereditary. I don't know about that. If you look at the stories of some of the great geniuses, Tesla and Albert Einstein, it's not like all those who came before and all those who came after were geniuses. Geniuses, that's a special, very complicated set of circumstances and brain physiology and mystical elements when you think about Tesla and Einstein. We've talked about that in past episodes of this show. Galton invents this new word, eugenics, which just means in Greek, good genes. That's it, good genes. Seems very innocuous. Seems very, okay, so let's look at good genes. How many people say, just hope he has good genes, or boy, that boy has good genes? So it's a thing, but it's called eugenics. It launches a movement calling for society to take affirmative steps to promote the more suitable races or strains of blood. So think about what I told you about these three stories, the quotes that I read, and now we're getting them in a context after the fact. Galton says this: what nature does blindly, slowly, and ruthlessly, man may do providently, godlike, quickly and kindly. This sounds very much like Dr. Moreau. Human progress depends on promoting reproduction by the best people in the best combinations to prevent the unworthy from having children. So where's the danger there? Who decides who is unworthy? These people went pretty far. So it goes to the United States fairly early on. And I told you about the Boston Brahmins. These are wealthy old families in Boston. At the same time, when it first gets started with them, they're advocating for an end to slavery, provided that nobody gets the idea that the races are equal. We can't have slavery. That's morally aberrant. But cohabitating, having equal rights, having these folks around us, that ain't cool either. So these bloodlines. So this is fathers and sons again. All right. In August 1912, this is where it starts to get eye-opening. Harvard President Emeritus Charles William Eliot addresses the Harvard Club of San Francisco. He's talking about racial purity. This is a former president of Harvard. Immigration. Now, Dracula, one of the big metaphors for things like Dracula is the pollution of the Western European bloodlines by the Eastern European bloodlines. Okay? Each nation should keep its stock pure. Irish Catholics should not marry white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Jews should not marry Gentiles, and blacks should certainly not marry whites. In the 21st century here, we have the Proud Boys, the Aryan Brotherhood, There are neo-Nazi groups in Eastern Ukraine who are being funded by the West because the enemy of the enemy is my friend. Again, go back and check out that Three Beards from last Wednesday night when we talk about this stuff. Now, there's a man that I respect a lot, and I've had the honor of editing some of his papers over the years. He's one of the foundational fathers of modern terrorist studies, and his name is Robert Pape. He's out of the University of Chicago, which is very progressive for economics, politics, things like that, even writing. And he studied all of the people who were being prosecuted. I think it's 195, 197 involved in the Capitol riots January 6th a year ago. And this is overwhelmingly about the browning of America. So the mixing of the races, the weakening of the white pure bloodlines is still very much in force in modern politics as we have here. Eliot was an outspoken supporter of a major eugenic cause in his time, the forced sterilization of people declared to be feeble-minded, physically disabled, criminalistic, or otherwise flawed. In 1907, this is well before the Nazis by 30 years, Indiana in the United States of America had the nation's first eugenic sterilization law. In 1911, in a paper, Eliot said that this blazed the trail which all free states must follow if they would protect themselves from moral degeneracy. So now we're not getting into mental and physical deformities. We're getting into moral degeneracy to sterilize people so that they don't do all of this kind of stuff. Jessica says, so disappointing that we haven't come further. I'm thinking about that. And in the past 2 years of the pandemic, we very much in a lot of ways moved back to the 1960s. Again, I told you that this would be part of this whole Russia-Ukraine thing. We are back in a whole nother level of the Cold War, which could potentially become a hot war. I was talking to my son in this office today, and as we were talking, I said, you sound just like Sting in his song The Russians from 1990. In Europe and America, growing feeling of hysteria, conditioned to respond to all the threats and the rhetorical speeches of the Soviets. So I feel like we've moved back decades in a lot of ways, and I'm extremely concerned about it. So they wanted to build a global eugenics movement. So Eliot becomes the vice president of the first International Eugenics Congress. This meets in London in 1912. So this is 20 years, 30 years after these books, and these ideas are starting to take hold, especially the Moreau, H.G. Wells-esque. So they all meet in London. They meet for 5 days. There's 400 of them. They meet in the Hotel Cecil in London. It's organized by the British Eugenics Education Society. And who presides over it but Major Leonard Darwin, the son of Charles Darwin. So we have devotees of Darwin, and then we have a half cousin of Galton, who started this whole thing. Now the first Eugenics Congress, it's actually his son who's presiding. Who was at this thing? Chief Justice of Britain, Arthur Balfour, the ambassadors of Norway, Greece, and France are there, and the First Lord of the British Admiralty at the time, Winston Churchill. Churchill wrote this: the unnatural and increasingly rapid growth of the feeble-minded and insane classes, couples as it is with a steady restriction among all the thrifty, energetic, and superior stocks, there's that pure bloodline again, constitutes a national and race danger which is impossible to exaggerate. I am convinced that the multiplication of the feeble-minded, which is proceeding now at an artificial rate. What does that mean? An artificial rate? Unchecked by any of the old restraints of nature and actually fostered by civilized conditions, is a terrible danger to this race. Winston Churchill, who went on to fight Hitler and the final solution. So probably what he was fighting Hitler for was a lot more complicated than the extermination of the Jews. This points to that. Theodore Roosevelt, who everybody said, oh, dare greatly, and everybody, Teddy and the teddy bear and the ride up San Juan Hill and all this kind of business with the Rough Riders and all of that. He created a national hereditary commission to investigate the genetic heritage of our country. This is what the Ahnenerbe did in Germany, going to Tibet and measuring foreheads and looking for the origin of the Aryan race. Okay, I'll tell you again. investigate the genetic heritage of the country, and to, I quote, encourage the increase of families of good blood and discourage the vicious elements in the crossbred American civilization. That's one of our U.S. presidents, Teddy Roosevelt. The Carnegie Institute helped to establish a eugenics record office. In 1914, Eliot, president emeritus of Harvard, helped organize the first national conference on race betterment in Battle Creek, Michigan. Eugenics had its seat at Harvard. It was everywhere, all through the different faculties, administrators. I could go on and on with this. If you're interested, I could send you my notes, my outline on eugenics. But let me tell you some of the people who were eugenicists in this country. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., father of the future Supreme Court Justice. Helen Keller, blind and deaf. And Helen Keller said that our puny sentimentalism has caused us to forget that a human life is sacred only when it may be of some use to itself and to the world. That was stunning to me when I came across that. George Bernard Shaw, the socialist playwright, but also purveyor of the Übermensch theory of Friedrich Nietzsche, that some people are above the law, and certainly the scientists that we were talking about. Francis Crick, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering DNA, said, hey, eugenics isn't bad. The Nazis just gave it a bad name. We got to repackage, rebrand this thing, and get it going again. This is post-World War II, folks. Alexander Graham Bell was on the committee of eugenics and said some very horrible things. Again, you can private message me whenever. I will happily send you my my notes on this. A man named Alex Carrell, an atheist, also a Nobel Prize winner, notable not only for the horrific stuff that he said and the fact that they called him the father of the gas chamber, but he was on the cover June 13th, 1938 of Time magazine with Charles Lindbergh, also sort of an American hero. Carrell said this in a book: a euthanasia establishment equipped with a suitable gas would allow the humanitarian and economic disposal of those who have killed, committed armed robbery, kidnapped children, robbed the poor, or seriously betrayed public confidence, in a book called Man This Unknown. And this is right as the Nazis are really taking power and ratcheting up in the middle and heading towards 1930s and heading to 1940. So that's what I have for you. I'm not here to try to sell you my books or anything like that. They're on Amazon if you want them. That's all I'm going to say. You could go back and get the titles and all of that. This was really about looking at this model and how it's manifesting today. I'd like to do much more of this kind of stuff. Thank you for staying with me tonight for a little more than an hour. Next week, we have George Uhas as a guest coming on to talk about imagination. We're going to have a special guest panel talking about angels and demons, fact or fiction. We're going to have a contributor panel about witches in fact and fiction and where those lines are drawn. This is going to be somewhat of a theme moving forward for us. Different kind of realms that we're going into. We've gone through the ghosts and the spirits, and we've gone through the UFOs, and we are going to go back to, Reverend Carter is going to be back on in April, a very popular guest. He and I have become friends, and I'm very honored for that. I'm writing a review right now of his Alien Scriptures, Extraterrestrials in the Bible. He's going to come on, so we are going to talk about this stuff. We're just going to talk about it in bigger scope and try to start to put some pieces together. Jessica, thank you. Ronald, thank you. Mark, thank you. Amy Jo, thank you so much. We are going to keep doing this kind of programming. I'm glad you like it. And I forget who it was. I think it was CL, but I definitely will put together sometime in the summer after my Allen Ginsberg tour. I will put together a Jack the Ripper pieces. I'm working on my novel and really organizing all that research so that I can share it with you. Right now, it's 50 pages of all over the place, and I'm typing it out and getting it all ready. So thank you all so much. Join us next week when we go into the outer realms, where the paranormal and the supernatural become the normal and the natural, and we begin to make sense of all these disparate things and look for the common threads to weave them together to give us some context. Stay safe. I'm hoping that this Russia-Ukraine thing does not blow up into something bigger. But NATO declared today that there is war in Europe. This takes us back even more to the 1940s. So we will see what happens. But everyone, please take care of yourself. CL says it was a lot of fun, interesting, and yes, Jack the Ripper. We're going to do that. Michael says, awesome as always. Thanks for always having great content. We're trying, and CL and Michael are going to help us with that. And Craig from Three Beards. Tanya will be back on occasion. She's blazing a new trail, waiting on some big information tomorrow, hopefully. So everyone, please keep good thought. We're at a crossroads in many ways about what life's going to look like for us. So take care, everyone, and we'll see you soon. I deeply appreciate you spending the evening with me.